Hello there, everyone. I am your host, the Sea Monster, and I welcome you all to the third and final part of my essay video series on Godzilla, the 2014 film. So back in the previous parts, we've covered the film's story, its thematic core, and its characters, both human and monster. For this part, we're going to cover how the film is done on a technical level, as well as go a bit in depth in the film's set pieces, as well as come to the end of this series as a whole. So with that said, let's get right into them. The action sequences in Godzilla 2014 are incredibly well done on a visual level. From the male Muto's breakout sequence, to the Hawaii sequence, to the climactic battle in San Francisco, the set pieces are intense and filled with many great, suspenseful, and exciting moments. The cinematography by Seamus McGarvey really emphasizes the sheer size and scale of the monsters on screen, whether if their scenes involve them clashing or even simply roaming about. Hawkmuto's breakout is a great showcasing of the creature's power, and it involves a very horror-like atmosphere of this seemingly unstoppable terror having awakened and breaking itself free, while lights and equipment are struggling to be maintained as everything and everyone at the facility start to break down into chaos, akin to a much larger scale version of the T-Rex breakout scene in Jurassic Park. Next, we have the Hawaii sequence, which builds a great deal of suspense of Hawkmuto coming to civilization after he is discovered eating nukes out of a Russian submarine. The tension ramps up when Godzilla enters the scene and causes a tsunami in Honolulu. Then it's followed up immediately by Hawkmuto attacking the airport where Ford finds himself narrowly surviving, leading up to Godzilla stepping in to fight him. Then we cut to Sam and El Brody seeing a news report of the battle on TV. A bit of a controversial creative choice to be sure, but I've already discussed a little bit about that back in part 2. Not to mention everything else before that is still very well done in giving us an intense, suspenseful sequence intended to fully and properly introduce us to Godzilla. Now, I did a One Monstrous Moment video on the Hawaii sequence from the first instance of the OMM movement back in 2019, and I praised it immensely for the aforementioned reasons, as well as how Godzilla's arrival strongly emphasizes his being a powerful, unstoppable force of nature that makes mankind seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things. However, I will concede that the film doesn't stay consistent with Godzilla approaching and causing tsunamis in his wake, considering that it doesn't happen again when he arrives in San Francisco, nor does it happen in any of the sequels. As much as I appreciate the thematic content and how it parallels to real-life disasters such as the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean and the 2011 Tohoku tsunami, it seemed like this moment was done for dramatic effect and to continue delaying Godzilla's grand reveal when the Muto's EMP attack taking out the electricity throughout Honolulu and Godzilla being shrouded in shadows would have sufficed. Despite that unfortunate detail, the Hawaii sequence is a great, well-done sequence when it's all said and done. So now we're brought to the climactic battle in San Francisco, which features some animalistic choreography between Godzilla and the Mutos, emphasizing their beast-like behavior in combat that's executed in a believable and exciting manner. There are highs, such as when Godzilla first uses his atomic breath and when he takes out Hawkmuto, and lows, such as when Godzilla is getting overwhelmed, and all that gives this monster battle an ebb and flow. And of course, Godzilla decapitating Femmuto by shooting his atomic breath down her throat is easily one of the most satisfying moments in any Godzilla movie ever made. This moment would go on to begin what may very well be a tradition of the MonsterVerse films going forward to have just as awesome, if not more awesome moments that would be akin to something that you would see in a Mortal Kombat movie. I do wonder how Godzilla was able to get the drop on Femmuto in order to deliver his finisher, though, especially considering how his size alone wouldn't allow him to stealthily approach his foe. Overall, the film boasts great action sequences that are truly such a feast for the eyes and features a lot of epic and satisfying moments involving the King of the Monsters that certainly stick out as some of the best moments in the entire franchise. Now, while I would certainly go on to call the action sequences in Godzilla 2014 to be very well crafted as far as pure visual spectacle is concerned, the film's final act does have some substantial flaws in its foundation, and they pertain to the plot point of the US military resorting to a nuclear warhead to try to take out the Mutos and Godzilla all at once. While this plot point doesn't break the film's final act like how a certain auto-defense system does in Shin Godzilla, it's still too significant of a part to ignore, and it's a shame too because it wouldn't necessarily need to be written out entirely, but rather just tweaked a bit. As it is, though, it's a significant enough issue to where it does affect the objective quality and how the film's events play out. The big problem regarding the nuclear warhead's place in the third act is that there was no reason to even have a ticking clock element in the climax other than to add to the suspense of Ford and his fellow soldiers' part in getting the warhead out of the city. It wouldn't be a problem if certain particular details were redone to where events would play out in a believable and logical manner. But as things are in regards to the climax, the ticking clock element remains problematic. While it may add to the suspense, unfortunately, the way events play out, such as how Ford and the military go on to use a tour boat to move the warhead out, shouldn't play out the way they do, especially considering how slowly the boat is going in comparison to how little time there is left on the bomb's counter. We also have the fact that the military have minutes to get the bomb out of the city by the time they get to it, especially considering that the bomb was set to an hour and a half before then. Lastly, we have Ford being extracted off the boat at the last minute via helicopter right before the nuke goes off. A boat like this, especially after it was stopped by Fenmuto's EMP ability for a moment, would never have been able to get as far as it does by the time the bomb's ticking clock hit zero. Even at top speed, that boat wouldn't be able to get the nuke away from San Francisco within 5 minutes. And keep in mind, the bomb had its digital components replaced with analog, and Ford and Company had to perform a halo jump in order to enter the city in order to counteract the Muto's EMP abilities. A movie like The Dark Knight Rises, for instance, at least establishes that the Bat, the primary mode of transportation for Bruce Wayne/Batman in the film, has jet boosters that allow for increased velocity to where it's feasible for Batman to get the nuclear core out to sea and to far enough of a distance for the explosion to not affect Gotham City. The case of Godzilla 2014, however, is a bit more problematic on that front. To be honest, the climax would have been better off if there was no ticking clock element, especially considering that the Muto's offspring feeding off the nuclear warhead and hatching is already more than enough of a good reason for the soldiers to get the nuke away from the Mutos and out of the city. Ford and the soldiers could have just been able to disable the bomb in time, stop the countdown, and just proceed to try to get the bomb out anyways, and the climax would still play out pretty much with very little difference. The long and short of all this is that the climax in Godzilla 2014 is pretty problematic in terms of the human side of things, which is why it's a good thing that the monster side of things is as well done as it is. That being said, the problems that arise from the nuke being introduced into the fray still remain. Another fairly sizable issue which pertains to the film in general is that Ford Brody has a bit of plot armor going on for him. Just because he's a soldier and could theoretically survive some of these scrapes, the amount of trips, falls, and landings that he takes and is able to get right back up from in the film, especially when we consider how the events of the film take place over the course of a few days, is a bit more than should be considered plausible. First, we see Ford being flung around in an armored truck that's tumbling around during the male Muto's breakout, without being strapped in or buckled up, I might add. He's insanely lucky to be walking out of that, I'm just saying. Later on, after Fenmuto attacks the train, he is forced to jump off the bridge and into a river, and let's just say that the bridge is a pretty great height, especially when we look at how high up it is in comparison to how tall Fenmuto is. Yeah, Ford should either be dead from that fall upon impact, or should have broken his legs, which means he would likely drown. And also the train fell alongside him, and he's pretty insanely lucky that the train didn't hit him either. Now, one instance that can be forgiven is when he is flung up by the explosion in the Muto's nest which he causes and hits the pavement. Not only do we see him actually prepping to make the jump from the explosion right as it happens, but we also see that even as a result of that, he is still clearly hurt and even limping after that. Good attention to detail right there, but it's still a bit questionable considering that this moment caused him to limp when he is shown to have survived and endured arguably even worse scrapes than that without injury. This plot armor does sadly affect the overall quality of how the film plays out going forward, because the story would end rather differently if Ford had a few broken bones earlier in the film, or if he died before he even made it to San Francisco. So now that we've gone over quite a bit about the film's action set pieces as well as certain issues with them, why don't we get into how the film just looks overall. Godzilla 2014 has a somewhat muted look, but it's still gorgeously crafted on a visual level. Seamus McGarvey's cinematography makes for some excellent camera work that gives the audience a really strong sense of scale anytime a monster is on screen, and also features amazing and even dooming shots, whether they involve a collapsing power plant, giant monsters looming or in the horizon, or halo jumpers descending into a storm and into a battle-ravaged San Francisco. Godzilla and the Mutos are also amazingly well rendered in all of their CG glory. The amount of detail that we see of Godzilla, from the scales across his body to the spines which resemble mountains or jagged rocks, to the amount of lifelike expression that he gives as if he were a living creature, is great and really well done. The same goes for the Mutos in terms of attention to detail in their figures, and though their faces aren't as expressive as Godzilla's, the Mutos' body language still makes up for that and allows for them to be able to properly convey their characterizations. The visual effects to this day still look fantastic, even for a film that's on its way to being a decade old. Now, I will concede and say that the film's muted look may not have been the greatest creative choice on Gareth Edwards' part in the long run, especially if one were to watch it on a smaller screen than a theater screen. Whether it's on a TV in a living room where light could potentially be shining through and glaring onto the TV screen, or on a portable DVD player, or even on their phone. For as great looking as the film is overall, there's a reason why we have things called movie nights, because this is one movie that's more worth watching in the evening with limited lighting than in any other point in the day. Nonetheless, the film boasts amazing looking monsters and fantastic cinematography throughout its runtime, even if the color palette of the film could have been a little less muted than it actually is. So it seems that we've gone over what needs to be gone over regarding how the visuals and action set pieces of Godzilla 2014 are executed. And considering that we've already talked about the film's story, thematic core, and character work in the previous two parts, I think it's time for us to come to a conclusion on the film's overall quality. With that said, time to bring this series to a close. Well. Seems that we are at the end of this little journey called an essay video series. I guess I should just go on and say that Godzilla 2014 is overall a pretty strong entry in the Godzilla franchise by an objective standard. While there are some flaws in the narrative, such as Ford having just a bit too much plot armor and the nuclear warheads placed in the climax being pretty problematic, the story is still strong and well executed while featuring some very well-rounded, well-realized human characters, some of which being rather underappreciated. The visual effects and action sequences are amazingly crafted on a technical level. The monsters are done with an immense level of justice, and the thematic core is well realized and well done to where it becomes a strong thematic foundation to be built off from by films to come. Godzilla 2014 stood as a favorite entry of mine when I first saw it in cinemas, and it's certainly still going to stand as one going forward. Seems to be a bit of a trend on my channel to hear a lot of praise from me regarding a MonsterVerse Godzilla film, I know. But hey, guess what? This film is rather deserving of that praise, warts and all. So that just about does it, folks. I would like to thank you all very much for watching this video and by extension this series. Now that I've covered the 4 MonsterVerse films released as of this series, expect me to do a video in the future where I will give a final overall assessment of what can easily be considered as the MonsterVerse's equivalent to the MCU's Phase 1, where we look at how the films released from 2014 to 2021 have done as an overarching narrative before we look ahead towards what is to come of the franchise. Outside of anything related to the Monsterverse, I'll be sure to signpost what my next big project is on the docket. Whether it's a 2-parter or 3-parter, or Godzilla help me, a 4-parter, expect an announcement to be on the horizon no matter the case. Once again, thank you all for watching, and until my next video or series of videos, I will see you all later.